Mike Maples. We've known each other so long that we're leaving our walkers at the door and probably can't remember exactly when that first Hobie's breakfast was. But welcome to Masters of Scale. You've got a new book coming out. I mean, we can obviously talk about venture and companies and ideas and AI and all the rest of the stuff. Mm-hmm. But Pattern Breakers is a new idea. Start by giving us a précis, in your own words, of what the idea, the core idea behind Pattern Breakers is.
Well, the genesis of the idea is I couldn't explain why things were working and not working. And so, Justin TV became Twitch, and I'd forgotten I was a shareholder in Twitch. And then it got acquired by Amazon for $970 million. And we made all this money. And I had to explain to my LPs that this wasn't in my financials, but what should I do? And they said, just ship us the money, we're good. And I'd noticed that 80% of my exit profits had come from pivots. Twitter started as Odeo. Lyft was starting to blow up. It had started as Zimride. Okta had started as Sasher. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'm just a lucky fool and I should retire before I get exposed. And this may resonate with some of your angel investing, Reid, right? Like some of this stuff, it's like you kind of misremember how it really happened. You can think you knew stuff you didn't really know, and it's more random than at the time than it seemed. And so the genesis of the book was I need to figure out if there's something else going on here that I don't understand or that's worth understanding, or it's just retire. I'm a lucky fool, in the words of Nassim Taleb, retire before I get exposed. So that the book was an attempt to answer those questions.
Yeah, and I remember actually when I was reading through it, because I read the whole book, it's a good book, I recommend it to people, is you're the person who sent me Fooled by Randomness by Taleb, and you reference it in the book,
yep.
Which I think is an excellent, I still think maybe that and Anti-Fragile are his two best books.
I agree.
So let's go into it a little bit, which is this notion of an inflection point. Which is obviously, part of the thought is, hey, look, you can have good ideas, but if you're going to create something that's huge, you're actually going to be, identifying something that's at an inflection point.
Yes.
And in the Valley, most often inflection points are talked about as technology,
yes.
right? It's like it's now AI, it's now mobile, and you talk about this a little bit in the book. But give me some sense of kind of how to think about technology inflection points, and then also how to think about other than in technology inflection points.
Yeah. So first of all, you're right. That is a big part of my theory, is that the founders who have breakthrough startups, even if they change their idea, the idea embodies inflections. And the reason is that business is never a fair fight. The only question is who fights unfair. And so the default assumption is the incumbents will fight unfair. The status quo has the advantage. And so the entrepreneur needs some mechanism to change the subject. If your product can be compared to the incumbents, you lose. You want to force a choice and not a comparison. You want to show up with something radically different that denies the premise of the rules. And inflections are the magical weapon that the founder has to do that, right? So founders don't care about moats. They don't have anything to protect. They have the ability to disrupt by bending the arc of the present to a different future. So when I talk about inflections, I'm pretty precise, as you point out, right? So like an inflection would not be LLMs. An inflection would be more like the iPhone 4S had a GPS locator chip in it that allowed people to locate people algorithmically for the first time. And so inflection as a term means turning point. In math, it's a turning point where the derivative changes in a curve. In technology or just social adoption, it's a turning point either in a technology's ability to empower in a new way for the first time, or it can be societal, right? So for example, with COVID, it was against the law before shelter in place to do across state lines telemedicine visits. But with the shelter in place laws and with COVID, they passed new regulations that said that that's okay. And so now for the first time, not only could you do a telemedicine visit across state lines, you might not have any option but to do that. And doctors were getting reimbursed with Medicare. So now all of a sudden the doctors and the patients had a reason to do something different. And ever since then, people's attitudes towards telemedicine have permanently shifted, right? And so you can't unsee that once you've tried it. And so what you're looking for is a turning point that causes people to have the potential to think, feel, and act differently than ever before. And, most people, when they talk about inflections, they talk about it in the negative sense. Andy Grove used to talk about inflections as a threat to his core business, but inflections are the weapon for the founder because they allow them to change the subject.
Well, there's obviously a parallel here to the Clay Christensen innovator's dilemma. And that was one of the things I was actually looking for you to cover a little bit more in the book, which I didn't actually see as fully. And I know you're a really thoughtful person, so I'll ask the question here: how do you track this against the classic Christensen innovator's dilemma?
Yeah. So, and first of all, I hope I state it well and do it justice, right? So my understanding of Clay Christensen is as follows: that you have companies, incumbent companies, that are actually doing a good job of innovation, but most of their innovations are sustaining innovations. And the reason that they prioritize sustaining innovations is twofold. One is they make more money when they do that, because they have customer bases and they can get paid for the innovation that they do. But the other reason that's more subtle, I think, is that there is there's a bias in their business, right? There's a bias towards doing things the way they have been done. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting is your existing customer base pulls you in a direction that causes you to prioritize increasing performance for the thing that you're building rather than serving unserved customers, right? So I think that the second part of Clay's theory is about what the upstarts do. The upstarts try to target not the customers demanding high performance. They target customers who aren't consuming, who are underserved or unserved, and they offer a solution that seems barely good enough and would be laughed at by the incumbent. But the early unserved customers are thrilled to have anything. There's an infinite demand for the unavailable. And so now all of a sudden they have something, they're like, this is awesome, this is amazing. And so to me, the disruptive innovation is like a process. It's a process where the incumbents execute well, and people who dumb the theory down say the incumbents are being stupid. They're not being stupid. They're doing what's financially advantageous to them from a return on investment point of view. But in the so doing, they leave open the field for new disruptive innovations that target underserved customers. And then over time, the underserved customers start to become progressively the more mainstream part of the market. And then they threaten the very incumbency of the established firm itself. That's my understanding of the theory, right?
I think that's correct about Clay. And so then the question is for these underserved customers, e.g. the change that's enabled by usually some kind of change in the market or change in technology, sounds like inflection.
Yeah.
How would you parallel between those two?
Yeah, and I think that in many ways, like startup capitalism is a new field, right? Like 100 years ago, we had business school. There's been all kinds of books and models and frameworks and stuff. The thing that I tried to do was explain the mechanism for how the disruption happens, right? Like, so if you read Clay Christensen, he's really good at kind of saying, here's why incumbents, even when they do a good job, don't head these things off at the pass and get disrupted by these new changes. But what he doesn't go as much in depth into is to say, okay, so you want to create one of these, what should you do? Peter Thiel does a great job in 0 to 1 talking about doing new things, but he doesn't say, okay, founder, you want to create a new thing, here's specifically what you could do. And so what I was trying to understand was like the specific forces that the founder can harness to make that disruptive idea happen. But I wouldn't say there's anything about what we're talking about that is in disagreement with what Clay's saying. It's kind of it's more of a this and rather than a this but, right? It's kind of an attempt to help founders stress test their ideas for whether they indeed embody inflections and whether they indeed embody insights, and whether they're therefore worth their talent and time to pursue, in the service of creating a disruption someday.
Yeah. Well, the other parallel with the inflections, and we'll get to the ideas and other parts of the framework, because I think that's one of the things that's very helpful in pattern breakers, which is this kind of being a little bit more close to the metal
Yes.
on how to help entrepreneurs think about this, exactly as you're mentioning. I think it's one of the things that's excellent on the book. Obviously another phrase that's frequently bandied about in Silicon Valley is contrarian but right.
Yes.
And obviously that's also tied to identifying these inflection points, because it's kind of like seeing a left where everyone else is going right, kind of thing. And that's identifying, an inflection point that's particularly interesting. So say a little bit about how that contrarian but right also fits into identifying inflection, because obviously one of the key things is if you misidentify inflection, a la your chapter on timing, or you do it too early, those have, usually less success in the startups.
Yeah. So here's why I like the word nonconsensus better than I like the word contrarian. So contrarian is contrary to something. And so most people who say I'm a contrarian, I view them as a different type of conformist because they're still reacting relative to how other people act, right? Like Peter Thiel talks about mimetic behavior. If you're reacting relative to how others act, even if you react differently, it's kind of like if I paint my hair purple and say, aren't I cool now? I guess some people might, but like if I'm doing it just to get attention, I'm not really being innovative. I'm defining myself relative to the other. And so what I like about nonconsensus is most of the really great startup ideas, when I talk to the founders after the fact, they almost feel guilty that they had a non-consensus insight. They came about it honestly. Mark Andreessen, when he did the Mosaic browser, he's not saying, I'm going to do something contrarian to the digital superhighway and AT&T and Microsoft Network. He didn't know enough about business to even know about those companies, right? He's just a kid. He's in college. And so non-consensus is what you're looking for. Non-consensus is independence of thought and mind. It's pursuing something at the edge for its own sake, because it's interesting to you, because you're obsessed by it, and you're trying to open new fractals of knowledge that have never been opened before. And so the other part of it that I find is non-consensus is people often tend to say to these founders, why are you wasting your time pursuing this idea you're so obsessed about? There's no obvious return in it. But by definition, every breakthrough is undiscovered. It hasn't happened yet. And so we can only discover breakthroughs if we explore the unexplored, right? And so that's the other part of non-consensus, is the willingness to go down a rabbit hole of what you're interested in for its own sake. And in so doing, you earn secrets about the future, right? And so that's kind of what I'm getting at. Whereas I find a lot of people have turned non-consensus kind of into a lifestyle or a way of showing up into the world where they just want to be disagreeable for its own sake. That's not what I'm getting at here.
100%. And that's, of course, what they contrarian but right. But I actually like the non-consensus term. I may crib off your alternative because, the way I critique the contrarian stuff is the contrarian to everyone else in the world is generally where you're crazy.
Yes.
The contrarian that's interesting is when you go against a body of expertise and you say, I think differently than this body of expertise for the following reason, which is essentially the non-consensus, kind of a non-consensus kind of point of view, because the consensus is expert consensus is Y, and I think X, which is different for these reasons.
Yeah, and you've always been really good about this when you've talked about what a great founder does, right? So I've heard you talk before where you say, look, when you have an idea, you want to have a smart person push back on your idea, and you want to be legitimately interested. Like when Elon Musk tells you, I don't think LinkedIn's going to work, he wasn't right at that time, but you knew something about networks that he didn't know. You know something about networks that he doesn't know in a few areas maybe, but like
a few networks,
but
yes.
Yeah, you're pretty good at those. But like, it wasn't that you're saying screw Elon Musk. What does he know? You're like, he's a smart guy. If he thinks it's not going to work, I'm going to listen at volume 11 to what he's saying. And if I still disagree with him, it should be because I know something he doesn't know. And that should cause me to have even more excitement about the idea. Because if somebody as smart as Elon Musk doesn't think it's going to work, I've discovered a fractal of knowledge that's even more important. And so you want to seek out, disagreement with your idea, but it's not disagreement that's valid because of who's disagreeing. It's disagreement because it's valid that your point of view, your vantage point on the future is better informed.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And the framework that I use is much more like this kind of theory of the game, but we don't need to go into that because we're going to talk about inflection and ideas. Yeah. So kind of quality recognition of good inflection points. of kind of like when do you know you've got one? And that's because that's part of what you were doing, is trying to make it more close to the metal for entrepreneurs to be going, okay, how am I thinking through this?
Yeah, so the term that I settled on was the stress test. And so you might remember in the 2008 financial crisis, Timothy Geithner would do the stress test of the banks. And I was like, I like that term. And so I thought, okay, I could stress test an idea for the power of its inflections and the power of its insight. And so with a stress test, I can say there's some things that we need to answer here. The first is, what is the specific new thing? And so, like, let's say somebody comes to me and says, AI is a revolution, it's going to change the world. I'm like, okay, I agree. What's the specific new thing that's an inflection? And they might say LLMs, and I'll say, what specific LLM? When was it introduced? What empowerment does it provide? What is the differential empowerment? Why is it not going to be leapfrog next week, next month? So the first thing you want to know is, what was the specific new thing? Was it a new law that was passed to enable telemedicine visits? Was it a new chip that was embedded in the iPhone 4S? Those would be examples. And so then the second thing I ask in the stress test is, why is it radically empowering, and who benefits from the empowerment? So like in the case of GPS chips in the smartphone, a whole lot of people are going to have smartphones. And anybody who wants to be located potentially would benefit from that empowerment in real time. And so, and then there's a third question I ask, or a set of questions. What are the empowerment conditions? So if the government outlaws GPS locator chips in smartphones, the empowerment will not be unlocked. And that happens, right? Like, we haven't had nuclear power plants in this country for 50 years. Nuclear power is awesome. Well, in my opinion.
I think you're right.
The empowerment conditions have not been met for nuclear to proliferate as a primary source of power in the United States. And so now the entrepreneur may have an answer to those things, they may not. But what I find is, the more willing you are to stress test the idea, the more likely you are to get the timing right. Because by getting that inflection precisely understood, you're understanding a specific window of time where a specific type of empowerment for specific people was available for the first time. And like, understanding that increases the odds massively that you're going to be right about the why now, which is arguably the biggest. I've heard you in your interview with, say, Mark Andreessen, right? Timing may be the biggest risk of them all. And so by pinpointing that inflection and pinpointing the turning point, you massively improve your odds of being right about the future and your ability to change it.
Yep, I completely agree, obviously. And this is one of the reasons why I was excited to invite you on to do the podcast with you in the book. So now let's move to the inflection to idea. And a little bit of this is kind of actually from has a parallel to an earlier Master of Scale episode, which is the one with Mark Pincus. It's the instinct in killing bad ideas. And part of that, I think, part of the infrastructure you're doing is saying, look, the ideas that you're testing against, inflection points are the product and service ideas, and you can work through them. And that's, I think, part of also why pivots can actually really work. So say a little bit about the inflection point and then ideas.
Yeah, and this is another, we might end up covering this as a extension of that. So, like, for example, if you take a company like, say, Zoom, Eric started this thing as SASB. It's a consumer product. But like, Eric had thought about video conferencing for over a decade. He'd been at WebEx inside of Cisco. And so what I find quite often is the inflection is subtle at the time. A lot of times the founder doesn't even know what the inflection was when they started their startup. It's useful for them to stress test it, but the reality is a lot of them benefited from the mechanism without knowing it. It's kind of like the Wright brothers made planes fly without knowing Bernoulli's law, right? And so, like, inflections, the reason I call it a theory is it's an attempt at an explanation for how breakthroughs happen, right? There's a breakthrough sequence. The insight comes from inflections and a nonconsensus and right view that comes from the future. That transfers energy to the product market fit phase, where we try to say, what can we uniquely offer that people are desperate for? And then if we solve that problem, then we go to the growth phase, and we're trying to grow at a predictable pattern and scale massively. And getting each phase right transfers energy massively into the next phase, right? And so that was what I was trying to do with the book, is kind of explain that, right? So now back to the how do you figure out if this makes sense, right? At the time, I think authenticity to the future that you're pursuing is the best signal I found. Like, you wouldn't have, if you'd looked at Zoom, the product for what it was at the time, and looked at Eric at the time, you would have gotten much more signal from the fact that Eric was who he was. Another example would be Justin Kahn when he started Justin TV. A terrible idea. But like, Justin wanted to be an influencer before influencer was a word, and you could tell when you met him. You just knew by talking to him. And, YouTube had just been the person of the year the prior year. And so I call this founder future fit. It's like the founder future fit matters because you're tinkering with inflections because you're interested. You're more likely to have an insight because you're discovering new fractals of knowledge and building what's missing in the future. But you're also more likely to attract early believers because everyone can see your authenticity, so people join your movement rather than the other guy's movement. And so that's the main thing. And so the inflections let the founder thoughtfully stress test their idea, but I don't find it as useful for ideation itself. I find that most of the great ideas just come from living in the future and experimenting with what's new about it and just being legitimately interested and having to deal with the fact that most people think that the stuff you're working on is not that important.
Yep. So one of the things I think may be a useful thing to cover is, how do you keep processing information? Like, what sources of information? How do you think about it to kind of have your kind of inflection theory current and accurate? Like, what do you do? What do you think entrepreneurs should do? What do you read? Who do you talk to? That kind of stuff.
Yeah. So in this way, I'm a little bit like a train spotter, but for startups. So we at Floodgate, we have this database of startups where you would have made more than 100x on your first check. And what we do is we create a time capsule. So we'll say, okay, what did Shopify look like at the time you would have had to decide to do a seed round? What was Toby like then? What was the pitch like then? What was the momentum of the business then? What inflections were discernible then? And what we're trying to do with that is, first of all, to figure out, is this theory a hoax and is it screwed up and can we falsify it? But the other thing that's important is, just because you have an explanation for how something happens, it doesn't mean that the signals are still easy to detect at the time, right? So inflections might be harder to detect than authenticity of the founder to the future that they're pursuing. I tend to believe that for the most part. And so then you say, okay, well, when we were looking at Shopify, or if you're looking at Zoom, or if you were looking at Twitter in the early days, or Lyft, or whatever company, Airbnb, what is the signal that was really most knowable at the time? So that's for investors. I think that for founders, it's more about, I'm pursuing something I think is interesting. How do I protect the ideas that seem dumb, but might be good, or at least worth pursuing more, Justin TV? And how do I eliminate ideas that sound plausibly good that aren't that good? And so, like Sarah Leary and Nirav started Fanbase before Nextdoor. Social network for sports fans. Social networks, huge. Sports fans, lots of them. That's going to be a huge business. What's not to like? The problem is there were zero desperate people for a social network for sports fans, which means you have a failed startup. That Sarah and Nirav are not stupid. They're great founders, as they've proven time and again. But they were pursuing an idea that was dangerous because it was plausibly good sounding. All the feedback they got was positive about the idea. Whereas most startup ideas, it's like you yourself as the founder aren't really sure if it's a big idea, but like you want to find some way to figure that out, because the only way you really fail is to lose your time, is to be 3 years into a startup that you wish you had a do-over with, right? I don't even mind if I work with a founder and we falsify the idea in a year, because then we get our time back, right? But you never get your time back if you pursue the wrong thing.
Well, it's time back, and it's also windows of market opportunity.
Yes.
Because they change, because there's inflection points, and then the inflection point hits, and there's times to do something and not.
Yes.
So the investor in me just has to ask, so you've done this detailed analysis about what are the things that you would learn from seed investings, in a whole wide variety of interesting things, whether it's the, awesome Toby Lutka and Shopify, to Brian Chesky and Airbnb, where you actually had mentioned, like one of the things in the book was Nate Blazarczyk,
Yes.
was like, well, I should have been paying attention to the cool shit he was doing.
Yes.
And so what are those tips that you might offer without asking too much secret sauce from, one VC to another
Yeah.
one?
So, it's interesting. So I'd say that the first thing that I've noticed is that you can't get too attached to the product for what it is being the right product. And so time and again, the product that ends up winning is not the product that you see when you're doing a seed investment. Yeah, that was true of Twitter. It was true of Twitch. It was true of Lyft. It was broadly true of Okta, although not quite as true. It was true of Zoom. It would have been true of Marqeta. It would have been less true, but true-ish about Shopify. It started as like Snow Devil, and then he turned it into a company. So that I'd say that the first major secret that I learned is that a great founder with a great insight that harnesses inflections has a first mover advantage into the future. And even if they're wrong about their initial implementation, they have the opportunity, because they're learning from other people in the future, to navigate the insight to the right product idea. And so time and again, I've seen that happen. And a good founder will figure out how to do that. And so where does that lead you? It leads you down a path of saying, what matters more is, are they a more authentic fit to the future that they're pursuing? Are they more likely to notice things that others won't notice? Are they more likely to persuade people to be early believers in what they're doing? Those things matter more than the features and benefits, and are they landing right now with the product? That's different in later stages. But I think in the early stage, in the seed stage, before there's any data, I think you're investing in two things: the power of the insight and the capabilities of the founders, and the authentic fit that they have to that future.
Yep. But one of the things you're reminding me of, you may know this quote too, but one of my favorite quotes from a science fiction author, William Gibson, is the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Yes.
And obviously, partially you're looking that insight is you're looking for the founder that's on the insight of the future's already here, just unevenly distributed.
I 100% agree. And so I look at it like there's a bell curve of where people live. Most people live in the present, and then some people live in the past, right? Some people, well, I'm not going to go into politics, but some people live in the past and want to, make the past continue to persist. Some people live in the future. And metaphorically, I think what happens is when you're living in the future, you're at the extreme end of the bell curve, and these inflections come over like an event horizon, and you see them first. And you're also with like-minded other people living in the future. And so they're more likely to see it just as you're more likely to see it, and you see it first. And so you're more likely to stumble into some fundamental insight about the impact of those inflections. And so that's what I find is like most people have the wrong idea about what vision is. They think vision is having better binoculars and seeing farther, right? But it's not. It's more like I'm getting my hands dirty in what's new about the future. I'm living in the future before other people do. And this is why I called the book Pattern Breakers, is that like I see firsthand the new ways of thinking, feeling, and acting afforded by these inflections that will now allow me to convert the prior pattern of doing things into a new pattern. Other people are going to think that tomorrow's going to be the same as yesterday. They're just used to doing things the way they've been. But now I'm encountering difficulties in the future. I'm Mark Andreessen. I can't make the internet useful. So I need to create a browser to make it useful for me. Your intuition about what to build is far more likely to be right if you do that. And so that's what we see. That's the William Gibson thought.
And say a little bit more, because this is one of the things I really liked. I mean, one of the funny things is you and I both know a bunch of VCs in Silicon Valley who are like, I'm a pattern matcher, and I actually prefer your jujitsu of turn to pattern breaker.
Okay.
Because I think that's the kind of, part of living in the future.
Yes.
Say a little bit more about kind of pattern matchers and pattern breakers as a mindset.
Yes.
So that, what does adopting the mindset look like?
Yeah. And this is a little bit, you'd asked earlier about Clay Christensen, this is kind of another extension of kind of what he was talking about, but that he didn't quite put a voice to. So, and guys like Kahneman and Tversky and some of the behavioral economists have thought about some of these things, right? But so the human mind is a pattern matching system. And it's a good thing that it is, because it's the thing that told us when you hear a saber-toothed tiger roar to run the other way, or, when it's really cold outside, get inside the cave. There are things that you want to do for your survival where, in order to make sense of a noisy, random world, you want to do things that are in your interest. And, fundamentally, our DNA says we're not even trying to be the smartest person in the world. We're trying to preserve our DNA by mating, right? And having offspring and surviving, right? To see that happen. So we are wired to match patterns, and we're also wired to match patterns because they help us fit into society, and they help us advance in society when we get good grades or achieve things or achieve status. So pattern matching isn't bad. The problem, though, is that, like all things with a pattern, it introduces a bias. And so, the problem with pattern matching is you don't see the thing right in front of you. Most people, when they saw the iPhone 4S, didn't realize that the thing in their hand or in their pockets could change the future, but the Lyft guys and the Uber guys did. And so most of us think it's not going to change. They don't see anything. And so the pattern breaker says, if I'm going to succeed as a business person and I'm an entrepreneur and I want to create a breakthrough, I have to break the pattern. Because humans are creatures of habit, and humans who are creatures of habit are going to consume from the incumbents, and they're going to buy into the rules of the incumbency. And so I have to break the pattern in order to escape the gravitational pull of the present, right? I have to do that by definition. If I don't do that, I'm failing to uphold a key part of my job description as a founder. And so I like to say great startups have to force a choice and not a comparison. I've got to have a startup idea that can't be reconciled with anything that's come before. Because if everybody likes your startup idea, that means it's too much like what's already there, which means it's not radical enough. And so you want an idea that polarizes people, that's terrible to most people or not so good, but a few people are like, oh my God, where have you been all my life? This is amazing, right? And so to me, that's what a pattern breaking idea feels like.
So, one of the things that kind of, what you're doing this in Pattern Breakers is, break it up into very coherent sets of ideas, a way to systematize ideation, right? It's part of the reason why it's in the vein of the lean startup and other kinds of things. And so we have inflection points, we have ideas. We also have this notion of movement versus go-to-market. Say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed, and I wish I could say that this was smart. It's more trial and error. And it's like, why didn't we say yes to that startup? Let's go back and see what we missed, right? So you mentioned Pincus earlier. I took him to lunch after Zynga went public to have him explain to me what I had missed. And so what a lot of these founders do is they don't market their startup in a traditional marketing sense. So traditional marketing, you say there's a set of targets, there's a set of programs, there's some inbound things, there's some outbound things. I've got a funnel. I'm going to go get those people and try to optimize the metrics around it. What I find is that the great startups very often are more like social movements. So if you look at a movement, typically, a movement has a minority of people who feel a sense of grievance with the status quo majority. And that minority of people wants to change the future. And they don't want to change the future just for utility reasons or for business reasons. They want to change it for aesthetic reasons. They want to feel a sense of transformation in their own lives and in society. And so like Martin Luther King, civil rights is a great example. He frames it in a way where I believe there's a future where people are judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. There's no middle ground in that. You believe that or you don't. You can't sort of kind of believe that's true. You either believe that's true or you don't believe that's true. But movements have this quality where you find early believers. Those early believers start to accumulate, but those early believers co-create the future with the founder of the movement. And so I started to realize, so for example, Airbnb, which I foolishly passed on, I noticed that Airbnb was a movement. Airbnb says, most people, because a movement takes the greatest perceived strengths of the status quo and turns them into weaknesses. It's a judo trick, right? So Four Seasons is the same in Paris as in Austin, Texas, as in San Francisco. If you want to have that awesome experience that they bragged about for decades, great. But when you're in Paris, wouldn't you rather live in a 17th century bungalow on the left bank for the same price? And when you're in Austin, wouldn't you rather live like a Texan? Or in San Francisco, wouldn't you rather be in Sausalito or something like that? And so what you do when you start a movement is you find people who believe what you believe, which is always a subset of the people. You create a higher purpose for the movement. You know, Tesla, it doesn't say we sell the best car. They say we're going to transform the world to sustainable energy. They don't even talk about cars. And then you get those people by appealing to a higher purpose, by appealing to a transcendent future, you get those people to move with you. And so the founders co-create the future with those early movers, and they create a sense of grievance against the status quo. Rather than say Four Seasons hotels suck, they say, hey, you have a choice. You can't compare Airbnb with the Four Seasons. It forces a choice and not a comparison. But like either live in the future we're describing or don't. And it's like, that was the brilliance of Airbnb. And I started to realize time and again, a lot of these were movements. A lot of these startups were movements. You know, Okta was Todd and Freddie knowing all the early adopters of Salesforce and cloud computing and seeing that they were having problems with identity management. But they didn't ever listen to customers who say, well, how does that compare with on-prem, right? If like somebody said, how does that compare with on-prem? They would have said, why are you wasting my time introducing me to that customer? They're not a customer for Okta right now. And so I think that's another important notion is this creating movements. And then a bunch of things flow from that, you know, the willingness to be disagreeable in the right circumstances, the skills required to be a great storyteller, to convince people to move with you, you know, all of those things kind of translate to making the movements real.
And that also reminds me of one other question. I think there's a good kind of set of the painting of pattern breakers. Say a little bit about what characteristics of founders. So it's the inflection point plus the talent team. What are the key things that as you kind of have done this index across them, you say these are kind of key characteristics of founders that are predictive of success?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about authentic match to the future they're pursuing. I think that's really important because it causes them to notice things others don't see, and it causes them to attract the early believers. There are a couple of other things, though. The first thing is this willingness to be disagreeable. And by that, I don't mean just be a jerk. Startups are fundamentally a disagreement with the present. And the present is going to fight back, and it's not going to fight back fair. The present isn't interested in negotiating with your future, right? And so, like when Lyft decided to launch an illegal service, it's not because John and Logan are like, screw you, San Francisco government, I thumb my nose at you. It's like they knew that if they'd asked for permission, that was to seek denial. They would have never been allowed to launch the service. So they had to launch the service. They had to get early believers. They had to have people madly in love with this product. And they approached the government not by saying, hey, pound sand, I'm going to break the law. They said, look, it should be clear to all of us that people would be better off if they can use this service. And so let's work together to figure out a law. Let's change the law the right way to accommodate that, because this law was written for taxi medallions in the 1930s. It wasn't written for today. And so most people aren't going to launch an illegal service. Most people would say Ann was in a board meeting and they're like, okay, the only downside of what we're about to launch here is it's illegal. And she was like, is it legally ambiguous or just straight up illegal? And they're like, we're pretty sure it's illegal. But Ann's attitude towards that was, okay, I guess we're going to have to work together with them to get the law changed. And that's the right attitude, right? That's the right attitude to have. If you care about the mission and the future you're trying to create more than you care about where you fit the status hierarchy or more than you care about keeping the peace. And so I'd say that I've seen, and there's other subtle takes on disagreeableness, right? The willingness to do wacky or seemingly wacky stuff, like Brian Chesky selling cereal to fund Airbnb, right? Obama owes and Captain Cane's Crunch, or Justin Kahn and Emmett Shear sold Kiko, which was the prior company to Justin TV Twitch. They sold it on eBay for $250,000. And I remember thinking, who does that? How does it even occur to you to sell your company on eBay? So, it's on some level disagreeableness means the willingness to not agree, right? It's a different word than jerkiness, in the same way that nonconsensus is different from contrarianism. It is a nonconsensus way of behaving in the service of your mission. And I found that, like, some people are naturally just wanting to fit in and to keep the peace and don't like to ruffle feathers. But some of these folks, are willing to be an outlier to break things.
So obviously one of the things that's all the rage these days in Silicon Valley is artificial intelligence. There isn't, I don't think, a startup that's being pitched these days that doesn't say we're the AI for, and it could be as absurd as we're the AI for reinventing ice cream. We're all seeing the tremendous number of this, and it's like, look, AI is very interesting. It is a new pattern of software, but all software investments are not AI investments, and there's particular things, e.g., inflection, theory of inflection points, that kind of go to this. What do you make of the current AI, tsunami that's going on?
And we need to spend some time on this when you're out here next, because I've been thinking about this a lot. So occasionally you get something even bigger than an inflection. I call it a sea change. And when you and I were young, the first sea change in our lifetime was probably I call it the era of mass computation. And in the era of mass computation, it was governed by Moore's law. And George Gilder used to say, assume that processing power is approaching free in the future. What would be valuable? What would be the scarce resources? And the unit of interest changed. You wanted a computer on every desk at every home, hopefully running Microsoft software if you were Bill Gates. Software became the rate limiting thing. So if you'd understood the implications of mass computation, you would have been much more awake to the possibility that software companies as businesses would be important in the future. So then in the early 90s, you have this era of mass connectivity. And rather than Moore's law, it became about Metcalfe's law. You were kind of one of the exemplars of this wave, right? It was about the entrepreneur thinks of themselves as a network operator. And rather than a computer on every desk in every home, you're trying to connect all the nodes in the world, and you're trying to create network effects between them, and you're trying to capture their attention. And in B2C, sometimes that meant ads, and B2B, sometimes that meant be the system of record, subscription revenue like Salesforce. But the rules shifted, and a lot of people don't realize this, but at the time, Microsoft didn't really know how to react to that shift. They didn't know what to do about Google. They didn't know what to do about LinkedIn or any of these companies. And so the new wave of the sea change of mass connectivity created counter positioning for the startups. It created a different thing of interest to go target that disrupted, right? And so now I think that we're heading into the era of mass cognition. I think that's the sea change. And so what I've been trying to figure out is, what are the types of units of cognition? Is it predictions? Is it classifying things? But it feels to me like there are cognitive activities that involve judgment that are more than just computation, that are now starting to become asymptotically free in the way that computation was in the mass computation era, or in the way communication bandwidth was in the era of mass connectivity. And so then you start to say, okay, in what cases does the incumbent have an advantage in that world? And in what case does the startup have an advantage in that world? I have to believe a startup will have an advantage in that world, because the next wave or the next sea change is always counter-positioned in some way to the prior one. And it's the counter-positioning that, if people think about insights from technology, but it also matters for the business model. And it's that counter-positioning that affords the opening, right, for these new companies to come in and disrupt everything and change the rules. So that's what I've been spending a lot of time on when it comes to AI.
Yep. And so here's a little bit of this. One of the questions I frequently get asked is, is AI going to be beneficial for large incumbents and for startups? And I just basically say both.
Yes. Yeah. Right? The answer is yes. Yeah.
Yes. And obviously there's some things which is more startup. It's one of the reasons why hyperscalers and those kinds of things are much more naturally out of, companies like, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, et cetera, and harder to do as startups for the cloud stuff. Yes. And we'll see where CoreWeave and those folks go. But on the other hand, of course, the classic kinds of things that startups can do that large companies don't is, They can focus on somebody who's not served or way underserved. They can take risks. They can move fast.
Yep.
They can do all of these things with kind of the new capabilities. And by the way, I like you use the word term cognitive because part of how I'm trying to get people to wake up to this is I call it the cognitive industrial revolution.
Yes.
It's the similar kind of question of superpowers. Now, a little bit, I think that's an interesting question, of course, on your, is it pattern matching? Is it prediction? Is it, is it classification? Is it, is all, but then which ones,
Yes.
Down to your inflection points are the ones that are going to be the things that a startup can go do. And it's definitely fast moving through the fog at the moment.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of things I've just noticed, and I wish I had it all figured out. But the first thing I've noticed is the AI startups that pitch me much more often have inflections than insights. And so I get pitched by startups all the time where I'm like, I can totally see why people will want this. I can totally see why it's empowering. I would want to use it myself. But I don't understand why there's not going to be 10 just like it. Forget incumbents for a second. I don't even understand why there won't be 10 startups. And I don't understand why Sam Altman's not going to have a demo in 90 days that puts you out of business. And so that to me is a great example of an inflection without an insight. And in those situations, it may make the world a better place, but all the surplus will flow to the consumer, right? So that's the first kind of thing that I've noticed about AI. I do think that there will be counter-positioned opportunities. I've seen some, Sarah Tovel at Benchmark talks about sell the work, not the software. And so you sell the result of the cognition rather than a seat of software for everybody. I could see that. There are enterprise companies so I'm involved with a company called Applied Intuition, and they're applying AI for EVs and autonomous vehicles. And if you're the CEO of a big car company, you need to know that the founders of that company can do the job, and they're not just going to take some generic model. And so Kasser Eunice, right, Central Casting, he grew up in Detroit, went to General Motors Institute, worked at Google. His co-founder was on Maps. He was working with the Waymo guys. I mean, if there's anybody who could figure this out, you would look at him across the table and say, he's the guy. But you're not going to buy off-the-shelf software to solve that problem. So I think that's another sort of opportunity. But I would say for the most part that I've seen the AI startups struggle to articulate the fundamental insight that they have and the true advantage that they have that's structural.
Yeah, one of the parallels of that is there's a number of, I think, high quality coder startups.
Yes.
Whether it's an independent engineer that you spin up, whether it's an amplifier of a software engineer, whether it's, some of that is there's a ton of very good teams doing that problem. Yep. And so I know that we're going to have an amazing set of products. But the question is okay, well, which of these, change the game? Which of them are, pattern breakers, I think is harder to see.
Yeah. And I see the other thing I see is actually an outgrowth of what you taught me during the Web 2.0 days, which was, in real estate, it's location, location, location. In consumer internet, it was distribution, distribution, distribution. And so you might argue that there's this bifurcation. There's some companies that are trying to take out technical risk, and they're raising more money than ever before seen to try to do that. That only makes sense to do if the problem that you're solving is so important that there will be no market risk if you solve it, right? So that's one extreme. But the other extreme is extreme market risk. I see these companies that are just, people pejoratively say wrappers on LLMs. But another way to think about that would be if you're one of those, you have to have a strategy that's distribution led. You have to have an advantage in distribution. Otherwise, you don't have a chance. And so one of the things that I'd be curious about riffing with you on one of these days is when you were doing network effects businesses, you had all kinds of techniques for understanding as a network operator, how do you attract nodes to this network? How do you think about the connections between the nodes and the clustering? How do you come up with new distribution tricks that the market hasn't figured out yet? But you had to make distribution not an adjunct to the product. You had to make it central to the philosophy of what the product was. And I think that what some of these AI companies, that will be another those are things I'm looking for, is who has a strategy that's distribution led, where it's not just going to be the empowering capabilities, but their ability to get distribution that's an unfair advantage.
And not surprising, I also share that lens as to what could be interesting and not interesting. What do you think what are some of what you would think of as your non-consensus views around the current AI tsunami? And I'll share some too.
Okay.
But let's start there as another, kind of lens into the AI stuff.
I'd say my biggest non-consensus view is just that I believe that startups are going to have a huge opportunity here. And I think a lot of people are saying that this is one of those waves where the incumbents have the upper hand. And this is what I think people are missing. I remember when the internet first started to become a thing, there were literally articles like in Upside magazine, which I don't think even exists anymore, but they'd say like, the internet doesn't have a business model. And I remember people really thought that. People were saying, oh, the internet, you're just getting eyeballs. There's no business model. And now like the idea that the internet wasn't a massive change wave that had extraordinary value creation profits for startups and incumbents alike is just silly. Nobody would even believe that anybody would have that argument. This reminds me a lot of the early days of the internet. You have companies that are overfunded that probably won't succeed. You have sort of hype cycles, and pretty soon there'll be some troughs of disillusionment. But like Google didn't even get started till 1999. And so there was a lot to happen in internet started to become a thing in 1994. And you could have said before eBay went public, well, what's Netscape really done? They went public, but then Microsoft went after them. AOL, kind of interesting. But and you could have said at the time, this new economy was overhyped. But what the NASDAQ 5000 bubble was simultaneously overhyped and true.
Yes, exactly.
And so I think that's true of AI. And I think we're kind of in this 5-year window where it's not completely obvious where to play, just like it wasn't completely obvious in the first 5 years of the internet. But all my instincts tell me that it's going to be massive for startups. How could it not be?
Yeah, my instincts are the same. I also, we share the non-consensus view about, because, people say, well, it's all about the size of the model you're training. So it'll be OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and that's it.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, no, actually, in fact, there's going to be a lot more than just the size of the model you're training.
Yes.
There's distribution, there is, taking risks, there's, new patterns of development, there's all kinds of things which you're looking for inflection points. I'd say my probably non-consensus point that I'd add to the one that you've mentioned, which I agree with because I think there's a lot of great room for startups. I'd say that people are not sufficiently generalizing from what these things are as language amplifiers. And, what that means, for example, is, they kind of say, well, yeah, sure, it does all this language, passes the Turing test, writes memos, responds to emails, kind of, interesting question about what happens with search, et cetera. But they're not thinking about the other patterns of language. Now, some of this is true, coding, law, some degree medicine, but they're also not thinking about okay, well, what does it mean for biology? There's relatively few that are doing, biology and medicine, drug discovery, that kind of stuff. There's relatively few that are doing, the other areas that I think language may actually, in fact, apply. It's a little bit like your earlier question of LLMs, like, well, what LLM and what and why? Because if it's just like, hey, we've got a wrapper on GPT-4, you're like, well, that's nice. Yeah. Right? You'd better have some other things because GPT-4 is going to become GPT-5, and a lot of people can put wrappers on GPT-4. Yes. So, that kind of rare uniqueness of the idea, I think, is still like, what are the areas in which this language device can suddenly create magic in areas that are not obvious to us? That's another one that I've been noodling.
So I'll try one more on you because I'd love to get your take on this. So the other thing I'm very intrigued by is how powerful simulation could be. And there are two things that got me thinking this way. First of all, applied intuition started to do really well, and car companies were paying a whole lot of money to simulate billions of miles traveled. But okay, that's obvious in hindsight. But then, I hear Elon Musk say, we tried to use robots on our assembly line and we couldn't get them to work very well. They couldn't assemble parts and deal with corner cases as well as humans could. And so my initial intuition was that people on the assembly lines were going to be the people that get marginalized and lose their jobs. But now I'm starting to feel like anything that can be simulated in the digital domain will. And, any problem that could be completely described and contained within a digital description will. Playing chess, driving a car. Biology is kind of interesting. Biology is really complex. But if you got to a place where you could simulate cellular behavior or things like it, you could imagine the drug trials that you could run on virtual people, virtual cells. And yeah, that doesn't mean that it's safe, but like you could save so much time and cost if you could simulate things better, if you could eliminate a lot of bad options and lean into good ones. And so that's the other thing I've been really interested in is everything in the world of atoms that can be simulated and simulated in a way that's very high fidelity description of how it operates, I think will be. And ironically, we'll be building some of these robots after we've built the virtual robot, after we get it to work in a virtual world completely. And then we'll say, okay, now push 3D print and have high confidence that the thing's going to work because we've gotten it to work without having to struggle with it in the world of atoms. So I'm really interested in that.
So I think that's correct, although I think there's a further tightening of the lens that's really important, which is what's your specific theory about why this simulation currently done will have a particularly good match to, opening up new landscapes, being a pattern breaker because, and funnily enough, like one of the things that I think is one of the ideas that I think was an interesting one, but is unclear if it plays out is, DeepMind's fundamental thought was, we're going to create a simulated world and then we'll have agents learn to be hyper intelligent within the simulated world. And then the agent play agent, Pong, then chess, then Go, was part of building up to that, to building intelligent agents. It's unclear if that simulated environment is yet good enough or anywhere close to good enough for creating intelligence. But on the other hand, the LLMs of ingesting large, portions of knowledge embedded in various forms of language. And by the way, to my earlier point, it's not just text. It can also be video and it can be, images and a bunch of other things that are also, things of information is the thing that's going. So the thing, and I agree with you that there will be some that come out of this. And there's a current, kind of wave in robotics, kind of embodied intelligence, which is, hey, we'll be learning from, kind of cameras and video and so forth. And we'll be getting other form of, kind of building something in an abstraction of simulation that will then be useful in the world. And you're like, yes, but only if the abstraction is a important, call it acceleration of the world of atoms and bits, because you can clock the simulation at like 1,000,000x to be smarter in the world of atoms. And then which are the ones that are the right mappings, I think will be an important, addition to the thing you just said.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's interesting because here's where I think my intuition was wrong. I originally thought, okay, if I'm an assembly line worker, those are the kind of jobs that are going to be obviated, because I thought, and a little bit snobbily, those people aren't as smart as like Garry Kasparov, who's a great chess player. But like now I've come to a different conclusion. Now I believe that some domains can be more accurately and completely specified in the digital domain. And what happens when that's true is that you can bundle cognition and unbundle cognition and, go to market in different ways. And, all of a sudden you can have it be a complement to human capabilities, but also a substitute in other situations. And so that stuff is just wildly interesting to me, just all of a sudden realizing that there are fields where the people in that field are very smart, but if they could be completely digitally specified, those people are more at risk than people who do things that can't be completely digitally specified, because then AI cannot be a substitute as easily for the human activity.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things I'm curious what you think about. This is way too coarse to be, kind of inflection point or anything else. But one of the things that I believe with some vigor is that anything that we count as a professional activity today or yesterday will, within 3 to 5 years, have an AI, use the Microsoft language, co-pilot. Because we as professionals always operate in language,
Yes,
whatever way that is, and you have a language accelerant in various ways. And so I think that the notion, like one thing, and obviously they'll change industries and change jobs and a bunch of other stuff, doesn't necessarily replace jobs, because my other line I frequently use is humans replaced with humans with AI. But like there will be a co-pilot for every professional activity.
yes.
And then this question is, well, which ones are going to be brought to you by Microsoft and Google and, et al., and which ones will be brought to you by startups is, I think, relevant to our investing business. Yes. But what do you think about that? Every single professional activity will have a cognitive amplifier, a co-pilot.
I agree with that. And it relates to this sea change idea. So like when each of these sea changes eventually reach a saturation point. So you got to a point where Microsoft did have a computer on every desk in every home running Microsoft software. It happened. And so then, but there weren't really any desktop software companies that were interesting started after 1990. And so then you have the era of mass connectivity. And now people are saying Facebook's a monopoly. These big tech companies are monopolies. You can't connect that many more people because most people in the world have been connected. Even if it's only half the world, you can't get 10 times more. So when I think about an era of mass cognition, what if these cognitive agents number in the trillions? And what if now, like, okay, you're answering your email, you have some ambient intelligence that knows, okay, if I get this Substack newsletter from this person, I like to read it, but I'd like you to go classify it, put it over here, so I just don't have to do any cognitive operations or load to do that. And so that's kind of where I start to think about unbundling intelligence, right? You could say, human intelligence is a bundle of a lot of different types of intelligences in one person, but there's no reason that you can't unbundle those intelligences and have agentic behavior for those different types of things. And so someday, as a professional, you might have co-pilots, but you might have agents operating the ambient background that are performing cognitive tasks on your behalf all the time, unbeknownst to you in some cases if it's not that important, and always surfacing to you if it's an exception or something like that. But like that's part of where I think the new abundance will come from, because now if I want to market to Reid Hoffman, I've got to market to Reid's agents. I've got to care what your agents think, because they might be a gatekeeper that I have to convince them that it's in your interest to engage with me before you're going to engage with me. And all my instincts tell me something like that'll happen. That will be, PR in the future will be, what does ChatGPT think about this, right? Maybe it's the most influential person in the world. And so I think that we're going to see more and more of that as well.
No, I agree. And I think that one of the things that I think is, kind of, how would you put this in this kind of this AI universe, which is what we do know is the skill set for how you're amplifying. Like, for example, if you say you're a graphic designer and you don't know how to use Figma or Photoshop, it's like, they're not really a graphic designer. And similarly, like, by the way, if you say I'm a professional and I don't know how to use a computer today,
yeah, exactly.
Right? You're like, no, you're probably you're not a professional. So, I think that kind of question is AI is the next sea change, to use the language of pattern breakers in that. Now, you did remind me of one thing that I don't think I've ever asked you about that I think would be fun to ask you about here, which is roughly, what is the good and bad of the monopoly theories relative to society? Because one of the problems I think that the current FTC and a bunch of other folks, don't realize is that, look, the businesses grow in ways that they're not challengeable by the front door.
Yes.
Right? That you can't just go separate of creating electric vehicles. You can't just go, I'm going to go create a new car company and do it the same way that Ford and GM and everyone else did it. You just can't do it that way because the businesses grow up and the startups. So it isn't universally constructible. So if you say, I want to create desktop search to compete with Google, it's like, well, that doesn't really work that way. The closest, I think so the question is, are you taking your current thing to forbid the future, to co-opt the future, and the future changes in some way? That's the thing to be paying attention to. And the closest in my book to this is the iOS, kind of app store, right? Which is kind of like the locking in, the app store versus allowing open development on top of it, which the internet allows and PCs allow and all the rest of the stuff for how to do this. And so I tend to think most of the antitrust discussion is actually, in fact, trying to it's restraining value from the future rather than enabling it.
Yes.
I'm curious what your view of this is and how you would frame that.
Yeah, and it's funny because I have a relationship to this topic because my dad was at IBM and Microsoft, right, when I was a kid. And so he was at IBM when they got sued by the government. He's at Microsoft when they got sued by the government. And in both cases, everybody said it is theoretically impossible for IBM not to persist forever as a monopoly in computing. And it's theoretically impossible for Microsoft not to persist forever as a monopoly. You let Microsoft put Internet Explorer in Windows, it's over. There will never be a browser again. And then I'm like, okay, well, Firefox, Google, they seem to have done okay. So I've thought about this a lot. Two main thoughts. One is, it is extraordinarily difficult to maintain a monopoly that's not coercive. So the only real monopolies that exist can be granted by the government and can be coercively maintained. And so people say, oh yeah, well, in the past, that wasn't true. The railroads, the government had to regulate the railroads because they became a monopoly. But what people always miss is that the government granted the railroads a monopoly and for largely good reasons. We wanted to have a transcontinental railroad. We decided that's a national manifest destiny type of thing. But the railroads didn't happen and the monopolies didn't happen because of free market capitalism. It happened because of a mixed economy and government intervention. And so you can't say that the free market was a market failure in the case of the railroads. And it turns out, if you look at all the trust busting situations, almost all of them were that way, that the government had a bigger role in creating the conditions for monopoly than people realize. So now you have IBM. Okay, they monopolized mainframes, I guess. Is that screwing the world up? I don't really think so. People once thought it did. Okay, Microsoft has a big market share in Windows. Is that really screwing up the world? I'm not really sure. People used to think so. And so I'm naturally skeptical of people who say this is a monopoly, they have to be broken up. So that's point number one, right? Point number two is the key, I think, is that you've got to have the option for alternatives. So there's a book written in 1970 called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And it basically said you can be patriotic to your camp or your tribe or your country or your city or your whatever, your university. You can be, that's loyalty. You can have voice. You can say, hey, I don't like this, let's change it. You can vote at the ballot box, and you can exit, which means that you can leave. The problem with monopolies is when exit is taken off the table as an option. So the reason I'm enthusiastic about Bitcoin is that we've lived through a regime where all of the currencies in the world were fiat currencies. So if you believe that the governments are overspending in the Western world and that the currency's getting hurt, I might be right, I might be wrong, but the problem is I have no option before Bitcoin to exit. I have no option to take my money business elsewhere. The same has been happening with universities. This is why I'm enthusiastic about the University of Austin. It's the universities have an accreditation system that makes it very hard for new universities to get created. And so, what you want, I don't know if the University of Austin will win. I don't know if Bitcoin will succeed. But systemically, I like it when alternatives can exist, because choice among competing alternatives is what gives voice its power. And it's what gives the monopolist the incentive to not just preserve its monopoly at the expense of the customer. So if I look at failing institutions in the Western world, almost all of them are characterized by the fact that they were granted a monopoly and there's no option for exit. And even just having the option for exit, even if it's not a better option, creates the dynamism for the monopolies to kind of reel in their desire to only propagate their own power.
Yep, totally agree. So, all right. So this has been great. We have some lightning round questions.
Okay.
So first, do you have a favorite specific example of a startup that changed focus drastically?
Yeah. So Odeo, they started as a podcasting company. A week after they announced that they were starting, Apple decides to give podcasting away on iTunes. Ev Williams tries to turn it into a business anyway, has a brave face, decides after a year and a half he can't make a go of it. And just totally by coincidence, Jack Dorsey is working on this thing that they're going to call TWTTR or Voicemail 2.0. And the reason I like that example is you can't really say that was a pivot based on learning from customers. That was just like trapping lightning in a bottle inside of a company that wasn't working. And I can't explain it any other way.
Which is also one of the reasons I missed the early investment, because I didn't invest in Odeo, but by the time they were going with Twitter, it was already going.
Yeah.
And I'd missed it. So what's one book besides Pattern Breakers that you think everyone should read?
One would be The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying by a woman named Bronnie Ware. She was an Australian hospice nurse, and she would spend time with people in the last 90 days of their life. And she asked, what are the things that you regret? And she would have a chapter on the regret from the perspective of somebody who dealt with the regret. I wish I'd been more authentic. I wish I'd lived life according to my own terms. I wish I'd expressed my feelings more. I wish I hadn't worked as hard. And then they would have the person who did the right version of that and you know, came out on the other side of it. And I find that it's good every now and then. And I don't mean morbid, but to be morbid about it, but it's good to remind yourself that it is going to end. And so, you know, when it ends, did you honor the gift of your time? And are you mindful about maybe the ways you're not honoring the gift of your time? And so I really appreciated that book a lot. That was a good one. The other one that I like is totally different field. The Seven Powers by Hamilton Helmer. I think it's one of the better books on competitive strategy that I've read. Everybody should read it. So I think it was good. The Art of Thought by Graham Wallas, the founder of the London School of Economics, written almost 100 years ago, is a great book on understanding the mindset that the most creative people in history adopted. So he studied people like Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein and Picasso and tried to understand, is there something these people do different from most people that causes them to come up with breakthroughs? And if I'd had more time in this book, that was the topic I was going to tackle, is that process. But I just decided I don't have enough expertise. I'm not a neuroscientist, right? I'm not a acknowledged enough expert to really tackle it yet.
If you could give an entrepreneur who's just getting started one piece of homework, what would it be?
Pursue ideas where you are intrinsically motivated for its own sake. Because the great ideas and the great breakthroughs can't be planned. There can't be a recipe for breakthrough by definition. If somebody has a recipe for a cake, it's because somebody made that cake. And so, like, there can't be a recipe, there can't be a methodology. There's a mindset. And the mindset is, think about something that you're obsessively interested in all the time at the frontiers of knowledge. And that's the unlock for unlocking the fractal of new knowledge and insights. But there's no recipe. There can't be one. Don't look for one, because it's wrong-headed to even ask for one.
What is the habit that has helped you succeed the most?
Optimism. It's probably helped me fail the most in certain circumstances, right? But I would say that, like, I tend to show up in the world as an optimist, and I tend to show up thinking there's always an answer, that every problem has a solution. There's always a way through. You know, it's only over when you decide to quit. The other one is a lesson I learned from my dad that I wish everybody had had the privilege of learning about, which is do your best. And so do your best to many people is an aphorism. But what I've come to realize is there's only one you, and everybody in the world has a set of comparative advantages because there's only one you. And so ironically, the best way to compete is not to watch what everybody else does. It's to understand how to show up in the world to be your best self. It's to understand how to honor the gift of your time as only you can honor it. And so if you do your best, you may not always be the best, but you couldn't do any better. And so that's all you can do is your best. And so do your best in the ways where you have an advantage based on who you are as a unique person. And you're trying to pursue that as a way to honor the gift of your time rather than to compare yourself to others. Right. I think Peter Thiel is really smart. There's certain things that he does that I will never be as good as Peter Thiel at. And so rather than try to catch up to him, I need to be a better version of who I am.
Amen. And actually reminds me of why I wrote my first book, The Startup Review.
Yes, exactly.
So when you're feeling stuck about a big decision, who do you talk to?
Oh boy, it depends. I used to talk to my dad a lot. We haven't caught up as much in recent years, but at Web 2.0, you were definitely high on the list. There's a coach that some people know about in Silicon Valley, Matt Mashari, and he's really good. And the thing he does so well is he'll sit you down and you'll talk about something and he'll highlight the issue that you know is the issue. You need to get off this board. And I'm like, oh man, I don't want to ask this founder. He's going to feel bad, blah, blah, blah. And Matt will say to me, okay, when we catch up again in a week from now, are you willing to commit to me that you'll have talked to that CEO and asked if you can get off that board? And I know that if when I talk to him next time, he's going to kick my ass if I haven't done something, right? And I know he's right to, right? So I'm like, shit, I don't want to have this conversation, but I feel even worse about being a wuss so that I have to explain to Mashari a bunch of excuses that he won't even believe, that he shouldn't believe. So Matt is really good at sort of getting you to do the thing that you just don't want to do for whatever reason, but he just will not give you even an inch of latitude in not doing it.
Yep. Very good. Yeah. Essential to have people like that in life.
Yes.
So last question, how would you like AI to change your future?
I would like it to find a way to let me live longer. I don't want to live forever necessarily, but there's just so much to know and so many interesting things to do in life. And, as I get a little bit older, I realize how over time you realize how many things in this life are going to be constrained from you to ever be able to really do. And so, man, it would be nice to have just more time to try more things, explore more careers, just try on different ways of showing up in the world and maybe find other ways to help people or learn from people. So I'd say if it can do that, I'd be a fan.
Well, great answer. Mike, thank you for joining on Masters of Scale. I always love talking with you.